The September morning in Chicago felt heavy with grief and unseasonably warm humidity. I stood beside my husband Robert's mahogany casket in St. Mary's Catholic Church, my black dress clinging uncomfortably to my skin as I clutched a crumpled tissue. The priest's voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling, his words about eternal rest and God's mercy barely registering in my mind. 43 years. That's how long Robert and I had been married. 43 years of shared breakfasts, arguments about thermostat settings, weekend trips to Lake Michigan, and quiet evenings watching the news together. Now, at 65, I was supposed to figure out how to live without him. Our daughter Michelle sat beside me, her hand warm on my shoulder, while our son Tyler held his wife's hand in the pew behind us. The church was packed. Robert had been a beloved high school principal for over 30 years, and it seemed like half of Chicago's South Side had come to pay their respects. Former students, now adults with children of their own, filled the wooden pews. Teachers he'd mentored dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Robert James Morrison was a man of integrity, Father Martinez continued, his gentle Mexican accent adding warmth to the solemn words. A devoted husband to Patricia, a loving father to Michelle and Tyler, and a pillar of our community who shaped countless young lives. That's when the heavy oak doors at the back of the church creaked open. A woman stepped inside, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. She was probably in her mid-40s, with shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the light streaming through the stained-glass windows. She wore a simple navy dress and carried herself with a confidence that seemed almost inappropriate for the solemnity of the moment. But it wasn't her appearance that made the entire congregation turn to stare. It was the way she walked down the center aisle as if she belonged there. Father Martinez paused mid-sentence, clearly uncertain whether to continue. The woman's heels clicked against the marble floor with each deliberate step. I could feel Michelle's grip tighten on my shoulder, and I heard Tyler whisper, "Who is that?" from behind me. The stranger stopped about halfway down the aisle, her green eyes scanning the crowd before landing on the casket, then on me. When our eyes met, I saw something, their pain, determination, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent church. "I know this isn't appropriate, but I couldn't let Robert be buried without saying what needs to be said." My heart began to pound. The church felt smaller suddenly, as if all the air had been sucked out of it. Around me, I could hear the rustle of people shifting in their seats, the uncomfortable clearing of throats. "Ma'am," Father Martinez said gently, "perhaps we could speak after the service." "No." Her voice was firm, but not unkind. "I've waited 25 years to say this, and I can't wait any longer." She looked directly at me, and I saw her hands trembling, slightly despite her composed demeanor. "My name is Catherine Walsh, and Robert Morrison was the love of my life." The words hit me like a physical blow. I heard Michelle gasp beside me, felt Tyler's sharp intake of breath from behind. The congregation erupted in whispers, but Catherine continued speaking as if we were the only two people in the room. "I know this is painful for you, Mrs. Morrison. I know you think you knew your husband completely. But there are things about Robert, about us, that you need to know. He loved me and I loved him, and we were together for over 2 decades." My legs felt weak. If Michelle hadn't been holding on to me, I might have collapsed right there in front of everyone. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not at my husband's funeral. "That's enough." Tyler's voice cut through the murmurs as he stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Security. Someone call security." But Catherine didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on me, and in them I saw not malice or cruelty, but a deep, genuine sorrow that somehow made everything worse. "I have letters," she said quietly. "Pictures. Proof of everything I'm saying. I didn't come here to hurt you or your family, but I couldn't let Robert be remembered as only your husband when he was so much more than that." The church had descended into chaos. People were standing, talking loudly, some heading for the doors. Father Martinez was trying to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by the commotion. Through it all, Catherine stood perfectly still, waiting. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Get out. Mrs. Morrison, get out." The words tore from my throat, surprising me with their force. "Get out of here right now. How dare you come to my husband's funeral and—" "Mom." Michelle's voice was sharp with concern as she studied me. Catherine's expression didn't change, but I saw her eyes fill with tears. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I truly am. But Robert would have wanted you to know the truth." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope, setting it on the edge of the pew nearest to her. "When you're ready, call me. There are things about your husband's last months that you need to understand." With that, she turned and walked back up the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet church. The doors closed behind her with a soft thud, leaving us all in stunned silence. I stared at the envelope she'd left behind, my mind reeling. 25 years. The love of her life. Letters and pictures. Mom. Michelle's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Mom, are you okay?" But I wasn't okay. Nothing would ever be okay again. Because somewhere deep in my heart, beneath the shock and anger and humiliation, a small, terrible voice was whispering that Catherine Walsh had been telling the truth. Father Martinez cleared his throat and attempted to continue the service, but the spell had been broken. The congregation was restless, distracted. I could feel their eyes on me, could practically hear their thoughts racing. By tomorrow, everyone in our neighborhood would know what had happened. The widow who discovered her husband's affair at his own funeral. As the priest spoke about resurrection and eternal life, all I could think about was how thoroughly my own life had just been destroyed. 3 days had passed since the funeral, and I hadn't left the house. The phone rang constantly, Michelle checking on me, neighbors offering casseroles and condolences, reporters from the local news who had somehow gotten wind of what happened at St. Mary's. I ignored them all. The envelope Catherine Walsh had left sat unopened on my kitchen table like a small bomb, threatening to destroy whatever fragments of my old life I was still clinging to. Every time I walked past it, my heart rate spiked, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Michelle had been staying with me since the funeral, sleeping in her old room and treating me like I might shatter at any moment. She'd hidden the newspapers that had picked up the story, "Funeral Disrupted by Claims of Affair," but I'd seen the headlines online when I'd weakly attempted to check my email. "Mom, you need to eat something," Michelle said for the 3rd time that morning, setting a bowl of soup in front of me that I had no intention of touching. At 38, she looked so much like I had at her age, the same dark brown hair, the same worried wrinkle between her eyebrows that appeared whenever she was stressed. "I'm not hungry." "You haven't eaten a real meal since Sunday. Dad wouldn't want—" "Don't." I cut her off sharply. "Don't tell me what your father would want." Apparently, none of us knew what your father wanted. Michelle flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Mom, we don't even know if that woman was telling the truth. She could be delusional, or she knew things, Michelle." The words came out before I could stop them. I'd been trying not to think about the details, but they kept surfacing despite my efforts to push them down. She knew he had that scar on his left shoulder from when he fell off his bike as a kid. She knew he always ordered his eggs over easy and got frustrated when restaurants got it wrong. Those things aren't secrets. Anyone who spent time with him could have noticed. She knew about the wooden box he kept in his workshop. This time, Michelle went completely still. The wooden box Robert had made in his high school shop class, where he kept old letters and photographs and small mementos from his childhood. I'd only been inside it a handful of times in 4 decades of marriage, and Robert had never mentioned it to the kids. How could she know about that unless— I couldn't finish the sentence. Michelle sat down heavily in the chair across from me. "Mom, maybe we should open the envelope. Maybe we should know what she wants to say." I stared at my daughter's face, seeing my own fear reflected there. What if it's true? What if your father really was? What if I never knew him at all? Then we'll deal with it together. But this not knowing is eating you alive." She was right. The uncertainty was worse than whatever truth might be waiting for me. With shaking hands, I reached for the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with Catherine Walsh's phone number and address, along with a brief note written in neat handwriting. "Patricia, I know you must hate me, and I understand why. But there are things about Robert's final months that I believe you have a right to know. He spoke of you often and with great love. This isn't about destroying his memory or hurting your family. This is about helping you understand who he really was. I'll be at home this afternoon if you decide you're ready to talk." "Catherine, she wants to meet," I said, handing Michelle the note. "She says there are things about his final months." Michelle read it twice, her frown deepening. "Mom, Dad died in the hospital after his heart attack. We were all there. What could she possibly know that we don't?" That was exactly what I was afraid to find out. An hour later, I found myself driving through a neighborhood I'd never seen before, about 20 minutes from our house. Catherine lived in a modest 2-story home with a well-maintained garden and a small front porch painted a cheerful yellow. It was the kind of house Robert would have admired, practical but welcoming, with attention paid to the small details. I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes, gathering courage. Michelle had offered to come with me, but I'd insisted on doing this alone. Some conversations, I was beginning to understand, couldn't be shared. Catherine answered the door on the first knock, as if she'd been waiting by the window. Up close. She looked older than she had in the church. There were fine lines around her eyes, and I could see gray threads in her auburn hair. She was pretty in an understated way, the kind of woman who probably looked better without makeup than with it. "Thank you for coming," she said simply, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't sure you would." Her living room was comfortable and lived in, with bookshelves lining one wall and family photos scattered on various surfaces. I found myself looking for pictures of Robert, but didn't see any displayed openly. "Can I get you some coffee? Tea?" "No, thank you." I perched on the edge of her sofa, still wearing my coat like armor. "I just want to know what you meant about his final months." Catherine settled into the chair across from me, folding her hands in her lap. "Robert was diagnosed with heart disease 6 months before he died. Not just the minor issues his doctor had mentioned to you serious, progressive heart disease. He was told he had maybe a year, possibly less." The words hit me like ice water. That's not his doctor said his heart was stable, that the medication was working. He asked me to go with him to his appointments. The ones he told you were just routine checkups. Catherine's voice was gentle, but each word felt like another nail in the coffin of everything I believed about my marriage. He didn't want to worry you or the kids, but he was scared. Really scared. "Why you?" The question came out harsher than I'd intended. If he was scared, why didn't he come to me? Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. Because he'd been coming to me with his fears and worries for 25 years. Because I was the person he'd learned to be vulnerable with. And I wasn't. That's not what I'm saying, Mrs. Morrison. Robert loved you deeply. But your marriage was built on him being strong, being the provider and protector. He felt like he couldn't show weakness with you without letting you down. I felt tears building behind my eyes. When did it start? The affair. 1998. Michelle was away at college. Tyler was a senior in high school. You were working at the library part-time, and Robert was dealing with some difficult situations at school budget cuts, threats to his job, pressure from the district. We met at a conference for educators. 25 years ago, I tried to think back to 1998, to remember if there had been signs I'd missed. Robert had seemed stressed that year, but I'd attributed it to work pressures. He'd started going out more in the evenings meetings, he'd said, or drinks with colleagues. I'd been proud of his dedication. He never meant for it to happen, Catherine continued, and he never stopped feeling guilty about it. There were times when he tried to end it, to be completely faithful to you, but he never did. No, he never did. The simple honesty of her answer was somehow worse than if she'd tried to make excuses. I sat there in her living room, surrounded by evidence of a life I'd never known existed, trying to process the fact that my husband had been living a double life for more than half of our marriage. Did he love you more than me? Catherine's eyes filled with tears. He loved you differently. You were his anchor, his family, his commitment to the life he'd built. I was his escape, I suppose. The person he could be himself with when the weight of responsibility got too heavy. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you, because I honestly don't know. He never said he wanted to leave you. Even at the end, when he knew he was dying, he never suggested that we should be together openly. At the end, my voice cracked. You were with him when he died. No, but I saw him the night before. He'd gone to the hospital that afternoon thinking it was just chest pain, but they kept him for observation. He called me from his room after visiting hours, asked me to come. I remembered that night. Robert had insisted I go home, get some rest, that there was no point in both of us being uncomfortable. He'd seemed fine when I left, joking with the nurses and complaining about the hospital food. He wanted to say goodbye, Catherine said softly. He'd been having chest pains for weeks, but hadn't told anyone. He knew this might be it. He should have called me. I should have been there. He did call you, Mrs. Morrison, after I left. You were the last person he spoke to. That was true. Robert had called around midnight, just as I was falling asleep. We'd talked for maybe 5 minutes. He'd asked me to bring him a clean shirt in the morning, complained about his noisy roommate, told me he loved me. Normal, mundane conversation between two people who'd been married forever. I'd had no idea it was goodbye. I need to see them, I said suddenly. The letters, the pictures, whatever proof you have. Catherine nodded and disappeared into another room, returning with a small wooden box that I recognized immediately. It was identical to the one Robert kept in his workshop, made from the same dark wood with the same simple brass hinges. He made this for me, Catherine said, setting it on the coffee table between us. For our 5th anniversary. Our 5th anniversary. I tried to calculate. That would have been 2003. The year Robert had surprised me with a weekend trip to Nashville. Just the two of us. The year I'd thought we were finding our way back to each other after the kids had grown up and moved out. Catherine opened the box, and I saw it was filled with photographs, letters, and small objects. She pulled out a picture and handed it to me, Robert and Catherine, at what looked like a restaurant, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. He looked younger in the photo, happier than I'd seen him in years. This was taken at Tony's, that Italian place on Michigan Avenue. We went there for my birthday every year. Tony's. Robert had taken me there for our anniversary 3 years ago. I'd thought it was a random choice, had even commented on how he'd seemed to know exactly what to order. She showed me more pictures Robert and Catherine at Navy Pier, at a Cubs game, walking along Lake Michigan. In every photo, he looked relaxed, genuinely happy. Not the tired, slightly stressed man I'd lived with, but someone lighter, more carefree. He kept a piece of our life everywhere, Catherine said, pulling out a small seashell. This is from a weekend we spent in Michigan. He said he wanted to have reminders of us that he could touch when he was missing me. The seashell was sitting on our mantelpiece at home. Robert had told me he'd found it during a faculty retreat to Lake Michigan. Another lie, another piece of a life I'd never known about. I know this is overwhelming, Catherine said, closing the box. I know it changes everything you thought you knew about your marriage. But I wanted you to understand that what Robert and I had, it wasn't casual. It wasn't just an affair. We built a life together, even if it had to exist in the shadows. I felt something inside me breaking apart, not cleanly but in jagged pieces that cut as they fell. 25 years, I whispered. 25 years of lies. 25 years of him trying to be two different people, Catherine corrected gently. It wasn't fair to any of us. but I don't think he knew how to choose. I stood up abruptly, needing to get out of that house with its evidence of my husband's secret happiness. I have to go. Mrs. Morrison, please. I know this is painful, but painful. I turned back to her, feeling anger surge through the shock. You think this is painful? You've just told me that everything I thought I knew about my marriage was a lie. That while I was home taking care of our children and supporting his career, he was building a whole other life with you. That he shared things with you he never shared with me. That he was happier with you than he ever was at home. Catherine's face crumpled. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. And you know what the worst part is. I believe you. I believe every word you've said because it explains so many things I never understood. Why he seemed distracted sometimes. Why he started working late so often. Why he seemed like a stranger sometimes, even though we'd been married for decades. I headed for the door, then stopped with my hand on the knob. Why now? Why did you have to tell me at his funeral? Why couldn't you just let me grieve for the man I thought I married? Because he asked me to. Catherine's voice was barely audible. The night before he died, he made me promise that if something happened to him, I would tell you about us. He said you deserved to know who he really was, not just who he'd pretended to be. I stared at her, feeling the last pieces of my world crumble. Even in death, Robert was still making decisions for me, still controlling what I knew and when I knew it. He said you were stronger than you knew, Catherine added. He said you deserved the truth, even if it hurt. I left without another word, driving home through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. When I got to the house, I sat in the driveway for a long time looking at the home Robert and I had shared for 30 years. Everything looked the same, the red brick facade, the oak tree we'd planted when Tyler was born, the flower beds I tended every spring. But nothing was the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. A week after my devastating conversation with Catherine, I found myself standing in Robert's workshop in our basement, staring at the wooden box I'd mentioned to Michelle. I'd avoided this space since his death, unable to face the half-finished projects and familiar smell of sawdust, and wood stain that reminded me so acutely of weekend mornings when he'd disappear down here for hours. Now, with Catherine's revelations still raw in my mind, I needed to know what secrets my own home had been hiding. The box sat on his workbench exactly where it always had, covered in a fine layer of dust. Robert had made it in high school shop class. I'd heard the story a dozen times over the years. What I'd never done was look inside it without him present, respecting his privacy even after 43 years of marriage. Now I wondered if that respect had been naive. With trembling fingers, I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a photograph I'd never seen before Robert and me at our wedding, but taken from a different angle than any of the professional shots I had upstairs. In this candid moment, we were looking at each other instead of the camera, and the love in both our faces was so evident it took my breath away. At the bottom, someone had written in Robert's familiar handwriting, "The day I promised to love Patricia forever." I meant every word. Beneath the photo were letters I'd written to him during our brief courtship, when he'd gone away for teacher training and we'd maintained our relationship through daily correspondence. I barely remembered writing them, but seeing my young handwriting brought back the intensity of those early days when every separation felt unbearable. There were report cards from Michelle and Tyler's elementary school years, every single one, including the ones I'd thought he'd thrown away. A pressed flower from my first Mother's Day corsage. Ticket stubs from movies we'd seen on our early dates. A napkin from the restaurant where he'd proposed with "She said yes" scrawled across it in his excited handwriting. But then, near the bottom, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small manila envelope, sealed, with my name written across it in Robert's careful script. The ink looked fresh, not faded like the older items in box. I opened it with shaking hands and found a letter dated just 3 weeks before Robert's death. Asterisk, my dearest Patricia, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and Catherine has kept her promise to tell you about us. I know you must be hurt and angry and confused. And I know I'm a coward for not telling you myself while I was alive to face the consequences. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to understand. But I need you to know that every word I ever spoke to you about love was true. You were not my consolation prize or my obligation. You were the foundation of everything good in my life. Catherine was something differente, a weakness maybe, or a need I didn't know how to satisfy within our marriage. I tried to end it so many times, especially in the early years. But every time I pulled away from her, I felt like I was suffocating. She saw parts of me that I couldn't show you, not because I didn't trust you, but because I was afraid you'd see them as failures. With you, I always felt like I had to be the strong one, the provider, the man who had everything together. It wasn't your fault. You never asked me to be perfect. But somehow I convinced myself that's what you needed, and I was terrified of disappointing you. Catherine never expected me to be anything but exactly who I was in the moment, worried, scared, uncertain human. With her, I could admit that I sometimes felt like I was drowning in responsibility, that I didn't always know what I was doing as a husband or father or principal. With her, I could be weak. I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like I'm blaming you for my choices, but that's not what I mean. I'm trying to explain something I don't fully understand myself. How can you love two people completely, but in completely different ways? How can you be faithful to one person and betray them at the same time? The truth is, I was selfish. I wanted the security and partnership and family that we built together, and I also wanted the freedom and acceptance I found with Catherine. I convinced myself that as long as I kept both worlds separate, I wasn't really hurting anyone. I told myself that what you didn't know couldn't hurt you. I was wrong about so many things. Catherine pushed me to tell you the truth for years. She said you deserved to know who you'd married, the good and the bad. She was right, but I was too much of a coward to risk losing everything we'd built together. Even at the end, when I knew I was dying, I chose to let Catherine be the one to tell you, because I couldn't bear to see the love in your eyes turn to disappointment. I need you to know that when the doctor told me about my heart, my first thought was about you. Not Catherine, not my regrets or mistakes, but about how unfair it was that you'd lose the partnership we'd built, the retirement we'd planned, the years we should have had together. My second thought was about how to protect you from the truth of what I'd been. My third thought was that you deserved better than protection. You deserved honesty. I asked Catherine to wait until after my funeral to tell you, because I wanted you to have the memory of saying goodbye without the pain of discovery. Maybe that was selfish too. Maybe I should have told you myself so we could have faced it together. But I need you to understand. Everything good in my life came from you. Every accomplishment, every moment of pride, every day of purpose and meaning started with the foundation you gave me. You made me a better man than I was, even if I wasn't good enough to deserve you. I never stopped loving you. I never loved Catherine more. I loved you both, differently but completely, and I know that's not fair, and I know it's not enough, and I know it doesn't make any of this right. Take care of Michelle and Tyler. Help them understand that their father was flawed but not evil, that people can love deeply and still make terrible choices. Don't let my failures define the good things we built together. And Patricia, don't let this destroy you. You are stronger than you know, braver than you think, and deserving of more happiness than I was able to give you. Find a way to forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours. Find a way to move forward. I will love you forever, in whatever comes after this life. Robert Asterisk. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Then I collapsed onto Robert's old stool and cried harder than I had since the day he died, not just for losing him, but for the years of partial truths and careful distances, for the marriage that had been real but incomplete, for the man I'd loved who had been too afraid to let me love all of him. When the tears finally stopped, I found Michelle standing at the bottom of the basement stairs, her face full of concern. "Mom, I heard. Are you okay?" I held up the letter with hands that were still shaking. He left me a letter. He knew. He knew Catherine was going to tell me everything. Michelle came over and read it, her expression growing more troubled with each paragraph. When she finished, she set it down carefully and looked at me with eyes that were suddenly much older. "Do you hate him?" she asked quietly. The question surprised me. I'd expected anger, judgment, demands that we never speak of this again. Instead, my daughter was asking the question I'd been afraid to ask myself. "I don't know," I said honestly. I should hate him for lying to me for 25 years, for building a whole life I knew nothing about. I should hate him for making me feel like a fool at his own funeral. But I keep thinking about all the real things too. The way he held my hand during Tyler's surgery when he was 8. How he learned to braid your hair when you were little because you only wanted Daddy to do it. The way he brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning for 40 years. The way he cried when you got married and when Tyler graduated from college. Michelle sat down on a storage box, watching me carefully. Those things can all be true at the same time, can't they? He could have loved this other woman and still loved us. "Your father thinks I'm stronger than I know," I said, gesturing to the letter. "But I don't feel strong. I feel like everything I built my life on was a lie." Was it, though? Michelle leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. "Mom, I watched you and Dad together my whole life. I saw how he looked at you, how he talked about you when you weren't around. I saw how lost he was the time you had pneumonia and were in the hospital for a week. Whatever he had with this Catherine woman, it didn't diminish what he had with you. How can you say that? How can you be so calm about this?" Michelle was quiet for a moment, and I could see her wrestling with something. Finally, she said, "Because I think I understand a little bit. Remember when Jason and I were having problems a few years ago? When I was staying here every weekend and we were talking about separation?" I nodded. It had been a difficult time. Michelle and her husband had seemed so incompatible, constantly fighting about money and career priorities and where to live. There was someone else. Not an affair, but there was a guy at work who understood me in ways Jason didn't. Someone I could talk to about my frustrations without feeling judged. And for a while, I thought maybe that meant Jason and I weren't meant to be together. My daughter had never told me this before. What happened? I realized that needing different things from different people doesn't mean the love you have at home isn't real. It just means you're human. Jason and I worked through it because we decided our marriage was worth fighting for, worth being completely honest about. But I could see how someone could make a different choice. I stared at my daughter, seeing a wisdom in her that I hadn't noticed before. "You think I should forgive him?" "I think you should forgive him for your own sake, not his. And I think maybe you should talk to Catherine again." Why would I want to do that? Because she knew Dad in ways we didn't. And if you're going to understand who he really was, if you're going to find a way to make peace with all of this, you might need to know more than what's in that letter. The idea of facing Catherine again made my stomach clench. But I could see the logic in what Michelle was saying. If I was going to move forward and Robert's letter made it clear that's what he wanted for me, I needed to understand the full picture of who my husband had been. "Will you come with me?" I asked. Michelle nodded without hesitation. "If that's what you want." That evening, I called Catherine. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. "Mrs. Morrison?" "Patricia," I corrected. "I think if we're going to talk about my husband, you should use my first name." "Patricia." I could hear the relief in her voice. "How are you?" I found Robert's letter, the one he left for me. There was a long pause. I didn't know about that. What did it say? That he loved me, that he loved you too, that he was sorry and afraid and human. I took a deep breath. "I'd like to see you again, but this time I want to hear about who he really was, not just about your relationship. I want to understand the parts of him I never knew." "Of course. When?" "Tomorrow afternoon. And Catherine, I'm bringing my daughter. I hope that's okay." Of course. I'd like to meet her. Robert talked about Michelle and Tyler often. After I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Not peace exactly, but a sense of moving towards something rather than away from it. Robert had asked me to be stronger than I knew I was. Maybe it was time to find out what that meant. The next afternoon, Michelle and I sat in Catherine's living room again, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Less confrontational, more like a conversation between three women trying to understand a man who had been important to all of us. Catherine had prepared coffee and homemade cookies, and I noticed she'd put away the wooden box from our previous visit. She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her wedding ring, a detail I hadn't noticed before. "You're married," I observed, gesturing to her hand. Catherine looked down at the simple gold band and nodded. "I was. My husband died 4 years ago. Cancer." "I'm sorry," I said and meant it. Did he know about Robert? Yes. Daniel knew everything from the beginning. We met 2 years after Robert and I started after we got involved. Daniel was recently divorced, had 2 teenage kids. He understood complicated situations. Michelle leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "How did that work? You were married to someone else while having a relationship with my father." Catherine smiled sadly. "It sounds impossible, doesn't it? But Daniel and I had an unconventional marriage. We loved each other, but we both went into it knowing we weren't each other's great love story. We were companions, partners, best friends. We built a good life together, raised as kids, supported each other's careers. But we also gave each other space for the relationships that fed our souls. And your husband was okay with that." I couldn't keep the skepticism out of my voice. He had his own close friendship with his ex-wife. They divorced because they couldn't live together, but they never stopped caring about each other. We all understood that love isn't always neat and simple. I tried to process this information, this glimpse into a world where marriage could accommodate such complexities. But didn't you want more? Didn't you want Robert to choose you? For the first few years, yes. Catherine set down her coffee cup and looked directly at me. I was angry and frustrated and heartbroken on a regular basis. I'd give him ultimatums, threaten to walk away if he didn't leave you. But every time I tried to end it, I realized I'd rather have part of Robert than none of him at all. "That must have been exhausting," Michelle said softly. "It was. But it was also fulfilling in ways I didn't expect. Robert and I had something that existed outside of obligations and expectations. When we were together, it was because we chose to be, not because we had to be. There's a freedom in that kind of love, even if it comes with its own pain." I found myself thinking about my marriage to Robert, about how much of it had been built on routine and responsibility. Sunday dinners, holiday traditions, school conferences, family vacations. All good things, meaningful things, but rarely spontaneous or chosen moment by moment. "Tell me about him," I said suddenly. "Tell me about the Robert you knew. Not our relationship, just him." Catherine's face lit up in a way that made her look years younger. He was funny. Really, genuinely funny in a way that surprised people. He did these impressions of the teachers at his school that had me crying with laughter. And he was curious about everything. He'd read articles about quantum physics or ancient history and wanted to discuss them for hours. I smiled despite myself. He did that at home too. He'd corner me with some article about black holes or Roman architecture. He was also anxious about things you'd never expect, Catherine continued. He worried constantly that he wasn't a good enough principal, that he was letting down the kids who needed him most. He second-guessed every decision he made at work. "I never knew that," I said quietly. "At home, he always seemed so confident about his job. Because he didn't want you to worry about him. He felt like it was his job to be strong for you and the kids. But with me," Catherine paused, choosing her words carefully, "he could admit when he felt lost or scared or uncertain. He could be vulnerable." Michelle shifted beside me. Mom, do you remember when Dad had that whole thing with the school board about the budget cuts? He was so stressed, but he kept insisting everything was fine. I remembered. Robert had been working 16-hour days, coming home exhausted and snapping at all of us over minor things. When I'd asked if he wanted to talk about it, he'd brushed off my concerns and changed the subject. He called me crying that night they voted to cut the music and art programs, Catherine said. He felt like he'd failed the kids, like he should have fought harder or been more persuasive. He was devastated, but he couldn't show that at home because he didn't want you to see him as weak. But I never asked him to be strong all the time. I protested. I would have supported him through that. I know you would have. And deep down, Robert knew it too. But he'd built this identity around being your rock, your provider, your protector. He didn't know how to let that go without feeling like he was failing you. I thought about all the times over the years when I'd sensed Robert pulling away, becoming distant or preoccupied. I'd usually attributed it to work stress or midlife restlessness, never imagining he might be struggling with vulnerabilities he felt he couldn't share with me. Did he ever think about leaving me? The question came out before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted asking. But I needed to know. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Once, about 10 years ago, when Daniel was diagnosed with cancer and I was spending so much time at the hospital, Robert saw how devoted I was to my husband, how completely I was able to give myself to someone who needed me. He said it made him realize what it might be like to be someone's only priority. My heart clenched. What changed his mind? You got sick. Do you remember that winter when you had walking pneumonia and couldn't shake it? You were miserable for weeks and Robert was terrified. He took care of you every single day, made you soup, drove you to doctor's appointments, sat up with you when you couldn't sleep. And he realized that you weren't just his responsibility, you were his joy. Taking care of you wasn't a burden, it was a privilege. I did remember that illness. I'd felt terrible for being so needy, so dependent on Robert when he was already stressed with work. I'd apologized constantly for being a bother. He told me that watching you trust him to take care of you, seeing how you let yourself be vulnerable with him, made him understand that what you two had was irreplaceable. That your marriage wasn't just about obligation, it was about chosen love too. Then why didn't he end it with you? Michelle asked the question I was afraid to voice. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, because I was diagnosed with breast cancer 6 months later, and Robert couldn't abandon me when I was facing the fight of my life, any more than he could abandon you when you were sick. The room went completely silent. I stared at Catherine, trying to process this new information. Cancer. She'd had cancer, and Robert had stayed with her through it. I'm sorry, I said finally. I didn't know. It's okay. I've been in remission for 8 years now. But at the time, it was terrifying. And Robert was there for every appointment, every treatment. He held my hand during chemo. He researched treatment options. He made sure I wasn't alone when I was scared. I felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, followed immediately by shame. How could I be jealous of comfort given to someone facing cancer? That must have been difficult, I said carefully, balancing caring for you and maintaining his normal life at home. It was impossible, honestly. There were times when I told him he needed to choose, that it wasn't fair to any of us to keep living in limbo. But he couldn't do it. He said he'd made commitments to both of us, and he wasn't going to break them when we needed him most. Michelle reached over and squeezed my hand. Mom, I think I understand now why Dad couldn't tell you. It wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about protecting both of you. I looked at my daughter, then at Catherine, trying to make sense of everything I'd learned. My husband had loved 2 women for 25 years. He'd cared for both of us through illness, supported both of us through crises, built meaningful relationships with both of us, and somehow he'd managed to do it without either relationship destroying the other. I need to ask you something, I said to Catherine, "and I need you to be completely honest." She nodded. "Do you think he was happy? Really happy living this double life?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "I think Robert was as happy as someone can be when they're trying to be everything to everyone. He had moments of complete joy with you, with me, with your children. But he also carried a constant weight of guilt and fear. He was always worried about hurting someone, always managing information, always trying to keep his worlds from colliding." So he wasn't happy. He was fulfilled, maybe? He got to experience different kinds of love, different aspects of himself. But happy? She shook her head. "I don't think Robert allowed himself to be truly happy. He was too afraid of losing everything he cared about." We sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Michelle spoke up. "Catherine, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you regret it? 25 years of loving someone you couldn't fully have." Catherine smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked completely at peace. "No, I don't regret loving Robert. I regret the secrecy, the pain it caused your mother, the way it complicated all our lives. But the love itself? That was real and beautiful and worth having, even under impossible circumstances." She turned to me. "Patricia, I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear, but Robert's love for you was just as real and beautiful and worth having. It wasn't diminished by what he felt for me." "How can you say that?" I asked. "How can love be real if it's built on lies?" "The lies weren't about love, they were about fear. Robert lied about where he was and who he was with, but he never lied about loving you. Every anniversary card, every 'I love you' before bed, every time he chose to come home to you instead of running away with me, that was truth." I felt tears starting again, but this time they felt different. Not the bitter tears of betrayal, but something sadder and more complex. "I don't know how to forgive him," I admitted. "I don't know how to forgive you. I don't even know if I should." "You don't have to forgive me," Catherine said gently. "I'm not asking for that. But Robert loved you imperfectly, but he loved you completely. And maybe that's enough to start with." Michelle and I drove home in comfortable silence, both of us processing everything we'd heard. As we pulled into our driveway, Michelle finally spoke. "What are you thinking, Mom?" I looked at the house I'd shared with Robert for 30 years, at the life we'd built together brick by brick, memory by memory. I'm thinking that marriage is more complicated than I ever imagined. I'm thinking that maybe people can love more than one person at a time without that love being fake or meaningless. Are you okay with that? I don't know if I'm okay with anything yet, but I'm starting to think that maybe the question isn't whether Robert loved me enough or chose me over Catherine. Maybe the question is whether the love he did give me was real and valuable, even if it wasn't exclusive. We sat in the car for a few more minutes, watching the sun set behind the oak tree Robert and I had planted together. He did love you, Mom. I could see it every day of my life. I know he did, and I loved him. I still love him, even though I'm angry and hurt and confused. I think maybe that's what I need to figure out, how to love someone who disappointed you, how to grieve for someone who wasn't who you thought they were. 2 weeks later, I was cleaning out Robert's closet when I found something tucked into the pocket of his winter coat, a small envelope with "For Patricia, when you're ready," written in his handwriting. Inside was a key I didn't recognize and a brief note. "Storage Unit 247, Maple Street Storage. Everything you need to understand." My hands shook as I held the key. Another secret, another revelation waiting. But this time, instead of feeling dread, I felt something like curiosity, maybe even courage. I called Michelle, and an hour later we were standing in front of Storage Unit 247. The key turned easily, and the metal door rolled up to reveal a small room filled with boxes, each one labeled with a year, from 1998 to 2023. "Oh, Dad," Michelle whispered. I opened the box labeled 2023 and found it full of photographs, letters, and mementos from Robert's relationship with Catherine. But also, and this surprised me, photos of our family, copies of letters I'd written him, ticket stubs from events we'd attended together. It was as if he'd been documenting both relationships equally, giving both the same weight and importance. In the box labeled 2010, I found a journal entry in Robert's handwriting. Patricia's birthday today. Took her to dinner at Giovanni's, the place where we had our first date. She wore the blue dress I bought her for Christmas, and she looked beautiful. Catherine called while we were getting ready, but I didn't answer. Some moments belong to only one person, and tonight belonged to Patricia. I wish I could give her all my moments, but I also wish I could give Catherine all my moments. How do you love two people completely? How do you honor both relationships without shortchanging either? I don't have answers, but I know I'm grateful for both of them. I closed the journal and looked around at 25 years' worth of documentation, not just of an affair, but of a man trying to navigate an impossible situation with as much love and integrity as he could manage. "Mom," Michelle said softly, holding up a photo from the box labeled 2018. "Look at this." It was a picture of Robert at Tyler's wedding, dancing with me at the reception. But what caught my attention was the inscription on the back. "Dancing with my wife at our son's wedding. This is what happiness looks like." I found similar photos throughout the boxes, Robert with our grandchildren, with me at various family gatherings with our friends, each one labeled with some variation of gratitude and love. It became clear that whatever else Robert had been struggling with, he'd never stopped treasuring the life we'd built together. In the final box, labeled 2023, I found one last letter addressed to me. Asterisk Patricia, if you found this place, it means you're ready to see the whole picture. These boxes contain 25 years of my double life, but I hope they also show you 25 years of genuine love for both you and Catherine. I kept everything because I wanted there to be a record of how hard I tried to honor both relationships. I was wrong to lie to you, wrong to put you and Catherine in an impossible situation, wrong to think I could love two people without consequences. But I was not wrong to love you, and I was not wrong to love her. Look through these boxes if you want to understand who I really was, or don't throw them all away and remember me, however brings you peace. But know that every moment of joy in these boxes, whether with you or with Catherine, was real. You asked me once why I never seemed to need anyone, why I was always so self-sufficient. The truth is, I needed both of you more than I could ever express. You gave me stability, family, purpose, a sense of home. Catherine gave me acceptance, understanding, permission to be imperfect. Together, you made me feel like a complete person. I know that's not fair to either of you. I know you both deserve someone who could give you everything, not someone who split his heart in two. But I also know that the love I felt for both of you was the best thing about me. Choose what to remember, Patricia. Choose what to forgive and what to release. Choose how to move forward. But please choose to remember that you were deeply, genuinely, completely loved. Always, Robert Asterisk. I read the letter twice, then handed it to Michelle. As she read, I walked through the small space, looking at the evidence of my husband's secret life. And slowly, I began to understand something that had been eluding me. Robert hadn't been living a lie. He'd been living two truths that he couldn't figure out how to reconcile. He'd loved me authentically and loved Catherine authentically, and the tragedy wasn't that one love was fake, but that he'd felt forced to choose between them when maybe, in a different world, he wouldn't have had to. What do you want to do with all this? Michelle asked, gesturing to the boxes. I thought about Catherine, alone in her house with her own collection of memories. I thought about Tyler, who still didn't know the full story. I thought about my grandchildren, who would grow up hearing some version of this tale about their grandfather. I want to understand it all first. Then I think Catherine and I need to decide together what parts of the story deserve to be preserved and what parts should stay private. Michelle raised her eyebrows. You want to work with Catherine? I think Robert would want that. I think maybe that's the only way any of us move forward, by acknowledging that we were all part of his life, that we all mattered to him, that we all lost someone important. 6 months later, Catherine and I sat in the same coffee shop where Robert used to meet with teachers from his school. It had taken us this long to sort through everything in the storage unit, to piece together the full story of Robert's double life, to figure out what we owed each other and what we owed his memory. I have something for you, Catherine said, sliding a small wrapped package across the table. Inside was a photograph of Robert. I'd never seen him laughing at something off camera, his eyes crinkled with genuine joy. On the back, Catherine had written, Robert at his happiest. I thought you should have this. Thank you, I said, running my finger over his familiar face. I have something for you, too. I handed her a small wooden box, not one of the ones Robert had made, but one I'd crafted myself in a woodworking class I'd started taking. Inside was a copy of our wedding photo and a note I'd written. Asterisk Catherine, Robert loved you for 25 years. That love was real and important and worthy of being remembered. Thank you for taking care of him when he was scared, for giving him a place to be vulnerable, for loving him enough to tell me the truth even when it was painful. I don't understand everything about what happened between the three of us, but I understand that love is more complicated than I once believed. Robert was lucky to be loved by both of us, and maybe we were both lucky to love someone so completely, even imperfectly. Patricia asterisk. Catherine opened the box and immediately began crying. I don't deserve this kindness from you. Maybe not, but I deserve the peace that comes from choosing kindness over anger. And Robert deserves to be remembered as someone who was capable of great love, even if he made mistakes in how he expressed it. We sat in silence for a while, two women who had shared a man's heart without knowing it, trying to figure out how to honor that shared history. Do you think he was wrong? Catherine asked finally, to love both of us? I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. But now, after reading his letters and journals, after seeing the evidence of how hard he'd tried to be faithful to both relationships in his own way, I wasn't sure. I think he was wrong to lie. I think he was wrong to put us all in an impossible situation. But loving both of us? I don't know if love can be wrong, even when it's inconvenient or complicated or painful. Catherine nodded. I've been thinking the same thing. What we did wasn't traditional or acceptable, but the feelings themselves, they were real. Yes, they were real. We finished our coffee and walked out into the crisp autumn air. Chicago looked different to me now, not like a place where I'd been betrayed and humiliated, but like a city where a complicated man had tried his best to love the people who mattered to him. Patricia, Catherine said as we reached our cars, thank you for helping me understand Robert better, for sharing your memories with me, for letting me be part of grieving for him. Thank you, too, for loving him, for taking care of him, for making him happy in ways I couldn't. We hugged briefly, awkwardly, like distant relatives at a family gathering. But it felt right, like a proper goodbye to the man who had connected us. That evening, I called Tyler and told him everything. Then I called Michelle and asked her to bring the grandchildren over for dinner. As I set the table, the same table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals, I realized that my story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter. I was 65 years old, a widow with a complicated past and an uncertain future. But I was also a woman who had been deeply loved, who had learned that marriage could survive imperfection, and who had discovered that forgiveness was less about absolving others and more about freeing yourself. Robert had been right about one thing. I was stronger than I knew. Strong enough to face the truth, strong enough to forgive, strong enough to build a new life from the pieces of the old one. And maybe, I thought as I heard Michelle's car in the driveway, strong enough to teach my children and grandchildren that love is complicated and messy and worth fighting for, even when it doesn't look like what we expected. The funeral had been halted when Catherine claimed to be my husband's true love. But the truth I discovered was more nuanced than that dramatic moment had suggested. Robert had loved her truly, but he'd also loved me truly. And maybe the real tragedy wasn't that he'd loved two women, but that he'd felt he had to choose between them instead of finding a way to honor both relationships honestly. I would never know what might have happened if Robert had told me the truth while he was alive. But I knew what was happening now. I was choosing to remember him as a man who loved deeply and imperfectly, who made mistakes but tried to minimize the harm they caused, who gave the best of himself to everyone he cared about even when it meant spreading himself too thin. It wasn't the story I'd thought I was living, but it was the story I'd learned to accept. And maybe, I thought as my family gathered around the dinner table, that was enough.